Hello, my name is Ben. I'm one of the co-curators of the festival this year. Welcome to day 2. And this conversation, Pixels in, People Out, an image-based ideology of space. So today we've got artist researchers Felicity Hammond, Nina Davies, and Julian Oliver. Julian Oliver is joining us remotely. I'll begin with bios. So Felicity Hammond is an artist and educator based in London. She received an MA in photography from the RCA and a PhD in contemporary art research from Kingston in 2021. She has exhibited at institutions internationally, including CO here in Berlin, Photo Museum Winther, I can't say that word, Kunsthalle, Extra City Antwerp, amongst others. And Felicity's work is downstairs at the moment in the foyer, and we'll be doing a performance around that work later today. Nina Davies is a Canadian-British artist who considers the present moment through observing dance and popular culture and how it is disseminated, circulated, made, and consumed. Oscillating between the use of fiction and non-fiction, her work helps build new critical frameworks for engaging with dance. Julian Oliver joins us from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and is an artist, educator, and activist. Active since 1996, his work has been exhibited at numerous museums, festivals, and galleries worldwide. Lectures related to his work have also been presented at many conferences and universities internationally. Julian has received many awards, among them the Golden Nika, a Prix Ars Electronica. So in terms of the session itself, well, with a focus on computer-human relations, this conversation will explore how algorithms shape public spaces by eradicating the human experiences that define place. Equipping these processes, ever new technological processes produce images that distance the built environment from the people who inhabit it. Drone photography, LiDAR scans, and satellite imagery capture the expansive macroscopic view of the city, rendering its materiality through hyperreal images that leave its localized microhistories buried below, out of sight, and pixelated at street level. Through a fidelity to measurement, these technologies attempt to dematerialize the human body that contaminates the possibility of objectivity and precision. This conversation takes up this tension between the human and the algorithmic, investigating the subject through tactics that challenge the totalizing perspective of the algorithm, to divulge a space seen from within, a landscape anchored to human life, not something to look at, but to live in. I'll pass over to Nina and Felicity and Julian. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so the way that we're going to kind of structure this conversation is that we've kind of got a few different topics, each of us, to kind of introduce, and then we're going to talk through those, just in case you think that we kind of divert and switch topic really quickly. We're doing that on purpose. So I'm going to start off, and I think that this image might be a little bit misleading because people might think that it's my work in the foyer, and it's not. But I sort of wanted to start off with talking about some of the things I'm researching right now, so it's not necessarily present within my work, but I came across a few articles about whether the term death by GPS should be considered an official cause of death. And so, hence the image. And I'm sure that most people know what the colloquial phrase means, but just in case anyone doesn't, death by GPS is when when any sort of use of a global positioning system takes you either into like an unsafe place, like I guess the middle of a desert where you don't have signal anymore and you die of dehydration, or takes you into a war zone, or I think the image here, I think there was like a bridge that hadn't been finished being built, or some work was being done on this bridge and a car like drove off the bridge. So yeah, or there's also like games as well and apps like Pokemon Go, which will use GPS, and people will be kind of like stood at the edge of a cliff trying to catch a Pokemon and not really realizing that to catch the Pokemon, they have to like walk off the cliff. And yeah, so I guess I've been sort of thinking, and maybe to also sort of put this into reference within my work, is a lot of my previous work has looked at how digital technologies are affecting the way we move. And I have a dance background, so I look at this a lot within sort of emergent dance practices that we'll see online, like in places like TikTok and YouTube, where the body starts to mimic digital processes. And I sort of look at that sort of being like, with kind of questions of like, why are people doing this now? How does this relate to a sort of larger socio-technical moment that we live in? So I'm kind of moving on a little bit into looking at GPS and this idea that it might be, if it's considered a legal cause of death, I guess, well, firstly I have a question of like, how would that change, if that happened, how would that change our relationship to death? And would that sort of open up more categorizations of like death by network? We can see like the recent example of this boy who was talking to a chatbot, a Daenerys Targaryen chatbot. I can't remember his name, but yeah. And so, yeah, and then I kind of am thinking about, you know, if this is considered a cause of death, why, I guess, how does it get categorized as you have like a cause of death and a manner of death, and you will have like both of those categories like filled out on a death certificate. And or I don't know if it's actually on a death certificate, but and so would something like death by GPS, if it is a cause of death, how would it get further categorized under manner of death? So would it be of natural causes, or would it be murder? Would it be suicide? There's loads of different categories that it could still be further put into. And in thinking about this technology that kind of relates to the body in the sense that it gives us directions and we just move. And I'm kind of at this point of thinking through, I guess, how this technology relates to like us moving through space, and how, I guess, we're sort of, I don't want to say it's sort of parasitic, but whether there is sort of a parasitic nature to the way that it's making us move, and we're not necessarily conscious or aware of how we're moving. So yeah, I'll kind of finish that little introduction.
No, it's super interesting. I mean, I think there's many directions this conversation can go in, and I know we've spoken before about maps, but actually the way you were describing sort of death by GPS to me just then made me think about the faith that we put into technology and the sort of, you know, the sheen that it places over things that makes us think that it's not human and therefore error is an impossibility. And of course, you know, this happens because of the phrase artificial intelligence, and we think about something that's artificial where actually there is a distance from I suppose, like human intervention, but actually, of course, underneath it, there are many, you know, human labour is really involved. And of course, we think about actually it's not artificial at all. So, I think perhaps there's a question about sort of why we put our faith so much in these kind of technologies, and how we might start to kind of rethink it and think about the errors that might be, that could occur. And the other thing, that I suppose I'm kind of interested in is the map, and sort of going back to GPS. And it's, you know, again, we haven't spoken about this, but seeing the photographs that you've chosen actually did make me think about, not long ago, I was driving my car and the map did tell me to almost drive into the Thames. There's this really strange part of London around the O2 Arena, where it's kind of constantly being built up. And I've experienced this exactly, where you sort of follow a map and you suddenly realise, what am I doing? I need to look at the road signs. And I think that the interesting thing about maps is that they have become these kind of live sort of interfaces that are being updated by the very users that are sort of traversing it. So you have you can see yourself within the map if you're driving or you're walking. You can kind of see yourself traversing it sort of in real time, but also...
Well, yeah, you sort of become part of the map. Yeah.
Exactly, and also that you can update the map, and it becomes this interactive tool. You register, you're using like an app like Waze, and you register an accident, and actually, maybe I say it's actually this really severe accident, avoid this route, but perhaps actually it's not so bad. So you have all of these, suddenly the map, this kind of, potentially objective tool, is becoming sort of riddled with opinion, and there becomes a real question mark, I think, over how we use them.
I'm just sort of keeping a little bit of time so that we can get through everyone's bit. Julian, do you want to respond to that before we move on to, yeah?
Sure, yeah, that'd be lovely. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Lovely. Good, yes, there's a long adversarial relationship between technology and the environment. And I thought it might be nice to sort of roll back to a bit of history rather than diving into maps per se, maybe a bit later. But just, GPS itself is a radio technology, and obviously it's a technology whereby we read positions from a satellite cluster. But that history goes right back to the origin of radio. In particular, we think about the word telegraph. Telegraph means to write at a distance. So we have reading and writing here. People, when they were sending telegraphs, they were writing. And it's something I covered a little bit in a piece commissioned for the Phoenix Gallery in the cutting room. The Crystal Line is the piece. If anyone would like to look it up, it does look at the history of radio in the context of very much the present day. But Paul Virilio wrote a pretty interesting book on war and cinema, and talked about the co-development of war and the moving image, referring to as a sort of a topographical amnesia at play there. One could say that never is a landscape changing so quickly by human hands as it is in war, and that was certainly the case in World War One, where the moving image and war were in a kind of co-development. Reconnaissance planes had to fly over this landscape that was changing, week by week. It was unrecognizable. New trenches were dug in, new structures were put up, etc. And so images had to be taken by these reconnaissance planes, but they couldn't be up in the air for long. So they started to take photos more and more regularly. And so the mechanism of the camera became automated. And more and more images could be taken in a shorter period of time. That needed to be done because the landscape was changing too fast to be remembered. The landscape itself forgot itself. And we do see a bit of that in the built environment in the cities, of course, cities changing so quickly that the map can't keep up. But at what point, however, does this new sort of streamed image, moving away from maps for a moment, start to dominate or kind of contain, or even, shape, or even perhaps end the thing that's being represented? At what point does the map as an operational image start to, dominate the territory? When you look at the present state of, say, drone warfare and the automated battlefield, we could look at that as kind of an evolution of radio, rather than writing it at, telegraph, of course, meaning to write at a distance. Drone warfare in the automated battlefield is really writing at a distance. And when fully automated, the human writer is removed, and the writer becomes a machine. And that's the automation of perception that many have warned of. And there's other kinds of image writing. Of course, there's aerial mineral exploration, you could argue, as sort of writing at a distance, writing on the landscape, where you have these, as Ben mentioned in the introduction, you've got these camera sensors, CMOS, CCDs, attached to these drones. But even in the course of mining exploration, you've got this thing called a quantum magnetometer, which will actually look for changes in Earth's electromagnetic field to give indications or signatures for certain seams of minerals or rare earth minerals. And I think of the idea of you know of drone, say, mineral exploration or studying of the landscape, even from a satellite perspective. At what point does it start to feed itself? At what point are the components dependent on certain minerals that are being mined? And would we look at a future one day where that whole process or whole metabolism becomes automated, and that writing at a distance starts to shape the very landscape itself in service of machines? I think I'll just leave it there for the moment.
I think that actually might be a good segue in terms of thinking about changing landscapes.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, Julian, what you're talking about is like this, you're talking about the sort of rapid and quite like violent extraction of the land through, and the camera is the tool here. You're talking, and at all of these different levels, whether it's beneath the subsurface to be used to extract minerals, whether it's used to extract data, it's used to image the landscape, again, for warfare, for violent means. So, I mean, in my own practice and my research over really the last decade, I've been looking at what the tool of the camera and also the tool of the photographic language as a way to dictate the space around us. And I'm going to sort of backtrack a little bit, because the image that I'm sharing as a backdrop here is, I took a really long time ago, but it was a sort of maybe like a bit of a moment for helping to like illustrate some of the ideas I was interested in. So this is a number of years ago, and I embarked on this research project to look at the way that computer-generated architectural propositions were starting to dictate the kind of material experience of the city. So what you can see on the screen, it kind of looks like a collage, but it's just a research image that I took on in a part of London called London City Island, which is, quite an aggressive new so-called kind of luxury development. And, I became very interested in the way that these computer-generated images are sort of printed and displayed as a kind of backdrop or in the foreground of the sort of city upturned as it's being built around it. So I came, I started this. I think one of the things that we were talking about before is that we're all artists here, so we keep on kind of coming back to perhaps our artistic methodology or what we do as artists. And I couldn't help but keep coming back to the camera and think about what is the camera and what's the role of the camera in all of this. So I started photographing these computer-generated printed images and kind of looking for the errors and the inconsistencies, because when they're printed, they're sort of warped and they're pixelated, and they start to they just fall apart. And actually, the kind of luxury that they to which they pertain is sort of unravelled a bit. So. I think maybe I should mention there's a great paper by an old colleague, Adam Brown, called The Spinning Index, and this is where I first kind of through conversation started thinking about these ideas around the reverse index. What happens when the city and the built environment becomes the trace of the images that imagine it. We usually use photography to make an image of an object, but of course here the image comes first and the object comes afterwards. And this has been, of course, a consistency throughout all of architectural history, but the difference here is the digitality and what that might point towards. So I think, this is a kind of method I've brought forth in my work, and something actually, you can see in the foyer here through the installation that I've made. I'm really interested in trying to kind of extract these ideas and something that might be hidden within the digital image and materialize it. So try and kind of perform that reverse indexicality that I'm looking at. And I think, maybe I had, some questions or some points for discussion, which was one of the things that I've noticed and maybe it's kind of quaint, because actually some of the digital images that I'm looking at, and this example as well, was maybe taken quite a few years ago, where digital or sort of digitally produced images that are meant to look like photographs, so computer-generated images. Of course, they've actually become way more sophisticated now than even they were 5 years ago. But I started to kind of to think about the way that the errors and those inconsistencies and the sort of warping and the pixelation might start to point towards like the planned obsolescence of the buildings that they imagine. You know, does the digital ruin start to talk about the ruin of the material world? You know, an example might be these kind of warped, pixelated bits of cladding around a luxury new build. And actually, you know, this is quite right, because this cladding is probably only made to last about 20 years, and people are buying leases for 99 years. What does that really mean? So I feel that there are all these kind of sort of somewhere just beneath the surface, the sheen, the kind of glossy sheen of the digital image, are all of these ideas that we can unearth. And maybe that's something I think that you know, you perhaps have both explored.
Julian, do you want to go first, or?
Sure. I feel like I'm sort of being historical take guy here. Hopefully not too much, but I feel that there's a
Take.
that there's a really important bridge there. You know, if we go back to the very first optical devices, which weren't actually European, the very first from the 10th century were from Al-Hasan al-Haytham, the Al-Hasan's camera obscura, as it was referred to back in the day. But then forward into, say, Roger Bacon's instruments in the 13th century, we started to see, you know, lenses, astronomic telescopes, and of course microscopes from the Renaissance. They profoundly already back then started to alter the context in which, you know, mental images. You know, this is before we get into computation. Mental images were topographically you know, stored and retrieved, and these were the new instruments of truth. And so we sort of moved to an era already then where we started to be able to act beyond our reach and see things beyond our reach. And that was quite an eerie time for ontology, cosmology, for the human brain itself, I think. And, you know, Merleau-Ponty talked about this as being a, a shift away from the I can map, or the I can of reachable space. In other words, the space in which we can visually operate in. And already there was, and I think this is really the link, what Felicity was just discussing there, that so began a distrust in perception and a shift to a faith in instrumentation. And that was sort of like a new situational, I suppose you could say, identity for mental images, where we started to read from beyond us from the very small or very distant, a world that you could say would be sort of near and very far at the same time. And, you know, telescopes and microscopes, they also, you know, bolstered scientism, similar to the faith in so-called computational neutrality that so many place in today, shifting ontologies and cosmologies, of course, at the same time. And photography, however, you know, it started to supersede the human witness, with mechanical images considered, say, irrefutable proof of the existence of, say, an objective, you know, strictly rationalist world. And the curious thing about photography, and we start thinking about, you know, computer generated imagery, but the curious thing about photography is that it began using light, which has itself no image, which I think is quite beautiful. Light has no image, and yet it creates images. And that's continued right on into thermal imaging, and right up and further into the electromagnetic spectrum, say out of the visible light space into X-ray imaging. But you start taking that into drones and automated mechanical systems. We start to sort of see through machines and movement, just transsituational, even sort of avatarial relationships. But now we increasingly leave the whole physical world behind altogether. Again, getting back to what Felicity was saying, where we work strictly with the synthetic light of raycasting and 3D rendering, and now increasingly, you know, strictly wholly generated imagery, so-called AI. And that seeds even further a new distrust in the supposed sort of unimpeachable mechanical witness of the photographic image. And so, any photo particularly unusual or surprising today is increasingly deemed, AI. That has to be AI, people will say. And it's photographic evidence of an obviously incredible, surprising, or unusual thing, but it's flipped over into through that mechanism of distrust as having been computationally generated. And so, the more sophisticated that synthetic photographic imagery becomes, the more the authority of photography as a witness is undermined. And I find that quite fascinating. And it's the very last thing I would say as regards buildings and the built environment. I remember back when I was studying architecture a very, very long time ago, already then people were starting to walk around and say that's a 3D Studio Max building, or and they're starting to look at certain lights and bits and pieces that looked like they had sort of been dragged and dropped from a software palette and put into the space. The already back then there was a distrust in the intrinsic integrity or authenticity of architecture through that software too.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It like leads to this sort of homogeneity, doesn't it? And I remember actually this came up in a panel discussion I was part of many years ago. But there was this case of a kind of stock image of this kid with a balloon, and it just kept appearing in all of these different rendered images. One in Dubai, one in New York, one in London, and because as sort of digital packages just became kind of more widely used within a kind of the kind of marketing material for new developments, suddenly you would get the same people or the same plants or the same kind of surfaces placed in one place to another. So it becomes very interesting.
I've sort of got like I guess maybe more of like a personal anecdote in response to what you've just been talking about, Felicity, where I was in 2023, I did a show at Matt's Gallery in London, and there's a performance version of it here today at 5 o'clock as well, which you can see. And it's where, it was responding to people moving like real life NPCs. And so the show was in the gallery, but then it kind of would be roaming around the areas outside of the gallery. And the areas it's in is a sort of like new generated sort of this sort of architecture, or the new development in Nine Elms, close to the American Embassy. And it was sort of a happy accident because these sort of moving like non-player characters from a video game really fitted that kind of architecture, because it just sort of felt like suddenly we were in that simulation. But right next to the gallery, there was this little model of what the developers envisaged this area to be. And I guess their plan was to always put a gallery in this space, which they so often do, try and put some sort of cultural space in these new developments. And they had like little tiny images of Andy Warhol's on the wall, and then which is obviously not what that gallery did. And then it had the little people, the little models of the people walking down the street. And I didn't make the work in response to that, but we were kind of saying it was ironic how they kind of got what they wanted, but the art wasn't the Andy Warhols on the wall. It was the little people kind of mechanically moving through the space.
It becomes interesting because then suddenly the residents of this new luxury development could be like, well, hey, what's this gallery with this kind of performance work? I was expecting Andy Warhols. And at what point do they go back to their contract and say, you sold me a flat based on this image, and this is not what I received?
And it's exactly what you got. Like, because I think there's also something about these images, what you're talking about, or these sort of predictions of what these spaces will look like, and where it actually does produce that, but the meaning of what those things are have changed. So it's not that they don't look like what they've advertised. It's that there's something that's been lost in translation in the seeing it through. Yeah.
Yeah,
Very nice.
it's really interesting because that, I mean, going back to that point of like, how we start to kind of draw attention to I guess the kind of information that's lost or, within these digital images. And I think that's why I'm so fascinated by the printed image or the billboard image, when what we usually see is on a screen and it's sort of, it's blown up to these huge proportions because all of all of those errors, the things that are missing just start to become apparent, I think.
Yeah, exactly. What time is it?
Yeah, we should.
Yeah, I think, Julian, do you want to move on to your final topic? Introduce your final topic.
Oh, sure. Only briefly, I suppose. Here, wanted to I guess think about. I suppose you would now. I realize, Nina, you would probably be the very best to digest and extend this. I just I was reading recently, regarding bodies and photography and synthetic image. I was reading Virilio's The Vision Machine, actually, and he recounts a really interesting chat between uh, Rodin and Gazelle, who was interviewing Rodin at the time. And Rodin was still grappling, like many artists at the time, with the photograph. Um, and Rodin was saying that people in photographs suddenly appear kind of frozen in midair, as though paralyzed, despite being caught in full swing and movement. And people were really struggling with this image of bodies frozen. Just even a person walking, a person reaching, a person, of course, jumping or running. Um, they hadn't known themselves that way. And Rodin said it's obviously because every part of their body is being reproduced at exactly the same time, the same 20th or 40th of a second. And so there is no sort of gradual unfolding of a gesture. And he refers at that point to his St. John the Baptist sculpture, where it really does appear that St. John is in movement, despite the fact being frozen in bronze. Quite nice irony there. And he says so there's no gradual unfolding of gesture as there is in art. And Gazelle objects and says, well, so when art interprets movement and finds itself completely in juxtaposition with photography, which is that unimpeachable mechanical witness, art obviously distorts the truth, right? And Rodin retorted and said, no, it's actually art that tells the truth and photography that lies, because in reality, time never stands still. And he really does have a point there. There is no such thing as that. Photography presents, in a sense, a fiction. And for Henri Bergson, he said that the mind is a thing that endures, and he wasn't talking about sort of suffering. Even though it's what is it? It's 20 to 5 in the morning here where I am, so my mind is a thing that endures. He was more talking about duration. And Arnheim, following on from that, Rudolf Arnheim, he understood in a sense how abstract all of this is. Sight itself comes from a long way off. Light makes ghosts of us in a sense. Um, yeah, and so the storage of mental images is itself nothing like a photograph. And so when we start building, ML and AI atop static images and start calling it mind, it's actually nothing like the way that we think. The storage of images is never instantaneous. In fact, if you talk to a neuroscientist, they'll speak more of say, mnemonic objects and mental objects. And Virilio was warning of this as being a kind of a rapid collapse of mnemonic consolidation. The synthesis is done for us, so we rely on images for recall. Um, and I guess I just wanted to, leave it there just to think about the body in the context of the image and how that shift, heralded in or ushered in a revolutionary change in the regime of vision itself. And so we're actually living in quite a different um, uh, cognitive surface or space than our ancestors of even just a few generations ago, in fact. And I do find that quite interesting. I think, Nina, your work points a lot to some of that stuff. Check.
Yeah, it's funny, just as you were talking, it was reminding me, and I was just telling you about it earlier, this case study I'd come across about the use of slow motion slow motion footage as evidence in court, and how if you show, or slow motion replay in sports, and how if you show, the case study was about this trial of this guy called John Lewis who had shot a police officer, and the whole incident had happened within 2 seconds, but the jury was shown the evidence, the security footage, only in slow motion. And so the case study was about if you show something in slow motion, and what's being decided here is about whether there was intent behind this crime or not. If you show it in slow motion, then it appears as if there was more time for this guy to make this decision. And when I'd come across that, I was also kind of thinking about I'm going to take also a historical kind of perspective on this as well, but when slow motion technology was first invented, it was intended to be used for scientific purposes or to help people improve their craft, like gymnasts. But it ended up getting adopted by the film industry as a sort of storytelling tool. And the idea was that you could use it to either see things that you couldn't see, or depict things you couldn't see. So it would be a moment that, I think there's a Kurosawa film where you're meant to, in the moment that slow motion happens, you're meant to kind of see the soul leave the body of the character. Or Scorsese uses slow motion to get inside a character's head without any sort of narration or any verbal language on what the character's thinking. And I was sort of thinking, I guess as well in this trial, how much, even though we've got so used to slow motion being used as a storytelling tool in cinema, how much also has it affected its use when we see it, and if we've got used to using slow motion to access feelings of desire or any sort of emotional state, desire, anger, whatever, then how does that affect that technology's use in situations where truth or accuracy of information is paramount? So kind of, what you were saying, Julian, kind of just was making me think about also this, maybe not so much the still image, but I guess, this sort of moving image of using slow motion.
Yeah, I mean, also I think, we're talking so much about, a sort of shifts in technology and how it relates to our kind of perceptions of truth or truth-telling. And I suppose that the final point that maybe I wanted to make around this is that we're all using fictions in our work. We're all using fictions as a way to try and kind of reveal this somehow. And, I've been sort of thinking about some of the commonalities in our work and others as well, where creating these kind of speculative futures or sort of injecting fiction into something that perhaps has roots in a sort of contemporary or current or sort of emerging technology, I suppose it's a question of why do we do that as artists, and what is it that we want to achieve through doing it, and what do we want to reveal? And I mean, maybe I could sort of suggest that for me it's so much about trying to, that the space of the kind of the speculative and the space of the sort of future world that we're building through film or installation or sort of intervention is about trying to kind of collapse all of these kind of overlapping overlapping realms that go into contemporary technological sort of computer image making and machine learning. So, for example, we might think about the space of the mind, which Julian has already mentioned as a kind of extractive space. We might think about the role of sort of data extraction or the use of the drone as something that kind of maps something larger. All of these sort of processes that are taking place in the subsurface and above, and sort of finding a way to build a world that can that can collapse all of these different registers of seeing and sort of unearth them and bring it to the surface. And somehow, for me, I feel like I need a fiction or a fictional space in order to do that. And I wondered whether we could end by reflecting on our role as an artist and what it is we're trying to achieve.
Julian, do you want to go first?
Sure, playing with reality. Of course, modeling other ways and opening up fissures and new potentialities. This requires, of course, the fiction or fictitious. I suppose I would mention just a little bit here with my most recent work, which I haven't finished documenting. I suppose was commissioned for the Arda Symposium last year. It does a bit of that in a way. It takes a traditional reflect telescope, a telescope of obviously being an instrument of truth, and modifies it such that when you're looking through that telescope, rather than looking at the cosmos that you might think you're looking at, you're actually looking at a 1.7 inch across screen with a machine-generated cosmos on it. So I put a telescope inside a telescope. You don't know that when you're looking through, of course, and you might be tracking and panning the real night sky, but in fact you're looking at an entirely machine-generated cosmos. And so that's a project about truth in this age of machine-generated content, where the path of cosmic light, if you like, is intercepted with that of a simulated universe, and asks that fundamental question that I think many people are asking in this era of machine-generated content. Do we know enough about the world we live in to be able to discern it from a simulation? I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think, I guess in terms of just responding to the use of fiction is, I've always kind of struggled to talk about dance as a sort of practice in the same way that we talk about other sorts of art forms, I guess, that we're critically engage in dance practices. And I think that sometimes that kind of, I don't know what the word to use for it, but it's almost like that negligence of kind of not necessarily being able to speak about why the moving body is like a sort of relevant topic of conversation, is something that I try and do in my work through writing with fiction. I sort of don't myself quite know how to talk about a dance practice in the same way that I can talk about sort of sculpture or painting. I mean, actually, I can't talk about sculpture or painting either because I don't really know that much about it. But, and so I feel like I'm not really explaining myself very well here, but I sort of want to look at these dance practices as like symbolic of the times that we live in, and that they actually mean something, rather than just kind of being these aesthetic forms that are made in a contextless sort of vacuum, and that they do relate. So I have to kind of write stories and try to, in a way, to move towards having a sort of critical relationship to dance practice. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that really answers your question, but yeah.
No, it's interesting though, because I think, more and more it's just, we're sort of using these spaces, I think, to explore, a contemporary concern, and even if that's outside of, the very sort of particular themes that we're looking at, it's a practice that, sort of exists with many artists. And I think, often, maybe we're in a world where we're sort of being asked to kind of validate our role or something, or, what impact is this going to have on, what, with your installation, what impact is that going to have on, autonomous vehicles? And of course, how can you answer that question? But it's something that perhaps, that perhaps comes up.
Yeah. Should we, we've got we've not got as much time. Yeah. Oh, we got 10 minutes. Okay. I guess we'll open it up to questions. I don't know if anyone's got any questions. Oh, we have 15. Okay. Okay. Okay.
Well, I think we were going to open it out to questions at this point anyway. And, I know in these kind of circumstances, it can be, it can be, it's not so intimate in an auditorium, but we're really happy to answer questions, whether it's about something very small and specific, or about some big ideas. But yeah, if you have any questions, please do go ahead.
I can't actually.
Also, finishing early is just such a rare and precious thing in a festival that, it's almost worth celebrating too. No harm in it. People don't have questions.
No, I don't think we've got any questions. So I can't actually see if anyone is, just wave their hands. Okay, well, I guess while we're waiting, just giving anyone time if they do actually have something that they're still formulating. Julian, I was actually wondering whether you could maybe explain a little bit more about your telescope, because I feel like I've kind of, in preparation for the talk, I've sort of tried to look a little more into it. And I guess in response to what you were saying, Felicity, in terms of like what the role of the artist is, and when you're saying like what people ask about the impact of like what your work has, Julian, from your website, it looks like this is like I don't know like how much of this is fictional and how much of this is real, but this telescope you've made, like it appears as if it's something that is going to actually have some sort of use, and I don't know how much of that is fictional or not.
No, the thing fully functions. When one looks through the telescope, you have the feeling of looking through a real telescope at the cosmos. In fact, it's a piece that's designed to only be shown at night and outdoors. It comes alive automagically at night. It switches off just as the sun goes down. And I've never made a piece specifically for a night context. In a way, it's also a little bit about the what's called the dark sky movement, the fact that we're losing so much of our contact with the cosmos through pollution, particularly air pollution, but of course light pollution in cities. I find that really interesting, how we are being cast as a function of contemporary civilizations, and late capitalist manufacturing emissions, just the daily grind of diesel in our cities, etc. That kind of virtualizes our cities, or virtualizes us. It encapsulates us in kind of a dome of ourselves. People have talked about that in the sense of a less multi-species reality, humans, cats, dogs, pigeons, versus the sort of the biological diversity and the reality of the sphere that we're on, hurtling through space. But losing contact with the cosmos, the more that we dig in civilizationally, I did want to talk about that with that piece. I do like the fact that rather than looking at the cosmos, one is in fact looking at a tiny display like that. And it took me a huge amount of time working out the light path, doing the light path physics, in fact, the optics, building little parts of the telescope just out of PVC pipe and putting lenses in them, etc., down to the sub-millimeter distances to actually get it to focus on the screen to look like it was the real cosmos. Even myself looking through the telescope at certain points, I can hallucinate that I'm seeing certain constellations that don't in fact exist. They only exist inside the machine. It's a piece I've had in my journal for years that I've wanted to make, so I'm kind of pleased I made it. I think of it more as a sort of a philosophical instrument in many ways.
I think there's a question over here.
Sure, maybe more a comment at going from the very beginning when you were doing the death by GPS, and you were talking about reading it. And I don't think you don't read GPS. You read a map, and you used to have all like paper maps. You had a bit of agency. You chose what part you're going to read. You chose to take that information and put it into the real world, and they were definitely separate. And with GPS, you're just kind of led, as if you're blindfolded and led through. That's why the people drive off of bridges. They're almost blindfolded. The first time I heard about that, it was some story of somebody in Croatia at night. Okay, it kind of made sense at night. But this idea that you wouldn't even be looking at the road, you'd just be following blindly to your death. And I thought that was interesting also because I've also noticed in the last years a kind of degradation of Google Maps, especially in Berlin. It's like for public transport. Public transport has its own problems in reality because of austerity, road work, lack of drivers, so on and so on. But the Google Maps is degrading slowly, but surely, wrong times, wrong places, not information. It also comes to the point where you have Google Maps, it's for free, so you're not the customer, you're the data set. So I was just wondering what it is to be involved in these simulated worlds that are themselves degrading. Because Google's not putting that much money into maps. They're just taking the information from the people using it and feeding it back to them, and then maybe giving that data set also to companies to sell you things and so on. So.
That's making me think of it. What's that term? The end-shitification or something like the, yeah. Well, I guess one thing is a question, one thing that I don't know whether you keep your maps updated. This is kind of a weird response to your question, but there's a thing about GPS where it's not, when they're talking about whether it should be included as like an actual cause of death rather than just a colloquial term like we use it now. The reason why you would turn it into a cause of death is for statistics and insurance and liability and all those kinds of things. And one of the things about GPS is that it's not actually officially a product or a service. And so if something is a product, then it's the person who supplies the product, they're responsible for whether it works or not. And if it's a service, you have to perform, as the user, you have to perform a duty of care, meaning that if you haven't updated your maps and it leads you to a certain area, but you haven't updated the app or the map, since it's had a new update, then it means that it's like essentially, there's no one's liable. Like it's your own fault, basically, that you've done that. I know it's kind of not really responding to what you're saying about, I guess, I really like what you said about you don't read maps. You kind of are like, you're led by them. And I think there is something, when you were saying that, it was making me think about how, I guess, there seems to be, there was kind of almost a separation of when you were reading maps, when it was an actual physical thing that you unfold and read. Whereas now, like what we were kind of just saying at the beginning about how like you are also on the map that you're reading, like you're a little dot on the map. So you're not necessarily reading the environment around you or even looking necessarily, predicting like which roads are coming up, which you need to turn down. You're kind of looking at yourself in this map. So there's kind of like maybe not a feedback loop, but yeah, there's something sort of a different relationship. Is there another question over there? Yeah, we've got one here and one over there.
Oh, should I start? Or Okay, yeah. Cool. It's kind of a follow-up because it reminded me of Google Maps reminded me more of movies as it always happens. Like a movie just plays as soon as I started it, no matter if I'm looking at it or not. So it's still happening even if I'm looking at the road, for example, and I can look back and it furthers it itself alone. And a physical map, to use that word, I have to actively read it. I have to have a question and I have to stop my car to, I don't know, look at it because it's not talking to me from itself. And I think that's the same thing a little that you meant, but it also related to the difference between a book and a movie for me, because a movie continues even though I'm not reading it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of mentioned earlier, it's an interesting point, but thinking about the transition, of what happens now that we read maps on screens is that they become these interfaces as opposed to, I don't know, I'm not sure what to call it as a paper map, as an opposite word to interface, but I think interface, it feels like a useful way of talking about the way that we use maps now. And Absolutely, it's kind of, it continues, no matter what we do, and it's connected. It's less connected to our eye, but it's connected to the machine that we are in. If that's our car, then it's it's sort of in a way it's responding to how that's moving, not to how our mind is responding or how we're deciding to sort of navigate space. So I think thinking of it in those terms is quite helpful, and also just thinking about the role that the screen plays in that as well.
Yeah, and I think also there's something about also, kind of brought up the example of Pokemon Go as well at the beginning, that, also we're using GPS not also just for like location navigation necessarily anymore. Like Pokemon Go, which is a perfect example. Not that I don't know how popular it is anymore. Is you're not actually going anywhere. You have no intention to go anywhere. The app is taking you somewhere, and there's also like loads of other kinds of apps like this, like geocaching or Randonautica. Randonautica is like a really weird and interesting one where you like are meant to choose a desire or some sort of feeling, and then it generates a location on the map, and you just go there. And so there's also like a weird thing where also even in the way that we use maps now is slightly different. Like we're not always necessarily, on a day-to-day basis, we are using it to actually navigate ourselves to somewhere on purpose. But there are like the kind of use of maps are sort of expanding, I guess, into a sort of like more entertainment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could add to that a little bit, I suppose. That maps are operational images. At what point do they start to operate us? And that's I think where it's is a question here binding those two that came from the audience. It's really important to remember, I think, that in order to make a map legible, you have to take information out. Every map is thus a necessary fiction. The more legible a map is, the fewer lines it has on it, and the more simple the legend, the more that's taken out of the map and its representation of the real. A one-to-one map with the real will, of course, be reality itself. Too much information. So in order to read the world, we need to take the world away. I find quite an interesting double bind there. You could, or inversion, or I suppose more of a loop, and that a really great book on this. It's kind of a popular book, but How to Lie with Maps covers a lot of that. But I think there's a lot, without getting too far into it right now, but there's a lot about the European or Eurocentric way of looking at the world here in maps. We have this idea of place as being a fixed position and us being at a single point in place. Just briefly, in 1998, when I was working for a virtual reality lab in Melbourne, the Royal Melbourne Institute of Tech, I wasn't aware of it at the time, but they were working to produce a map of Australia, a sort of a 3D fly-through that you could look in VR. And one of the customers of this intended fly-through was supposedly mining conglomerates, such that they could fly over the landscape of Australia and look for maybe places where they could mine uranium. Not many people know, but much of the world's uranium comes from Australia. And one of the problems that they were having is locating Aboriginal populations. They were supposed to occupy single places on that landscape, whereas in fact, for many Aboriginal peoples, as I'm sure many of you know, they are moving around across the year. They don't occupy a single place. They take place kind of with them in that sense. They'll go somewhere which affords them certain livabilities, etc. It meets their dietary needs and etc. across the course of the year. But the mining conglomerate really needed them to occupy certain places such that they could plan where to mine relative to them, so as not to pollute their water supply with uranium runoff, etc., which was a real problem back then and probably still is today. I just find that really interesting that, maybe we should have maps that are in fact constantly changing. The very idea that there would be a static map in a changing world is already quite bizarre, really. And when big tech owns that space, effectively is the interface to our world around us without even necessarily living in the cities that we live in, experiencing and knowing the places that we actually occupy, I find that to be a jarring and imperialist, an overhanded position, really. There, yeah. Check.
I think, yeah, this is super interesting. There was one more question. I'm just aware of time. Maybe there's time for the last one.
Oh, no. Well, okay, well, yeah.
So there was this second last question about maps. We are not reading maps, but they are leading us. And this reminds me of this famous quote by Alan Kay, computer scientist, about literacy. Media literacy, being literate in a technology means not just being able to read it, but writing it. But then, if we are even losing our way or capability to read a map, it's just leading us. What does it do to us? And I would like to ask you to reflect on this, that what happens with, like we are not reading the news, but they are leading us. If you have any comment on this.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of, even just, I've just been away for the last week and in various places and in spaces that I don't know, so maps have become a really important tool for me. And I mean, perhaps this is a slight diversion from your question, but I was using maps at night and, trying to get to where I needed to go to. And it sent me down this incredibly quiet, dark route that actually, really as a woman, I probably would never really take on my own, where I live. And I had that moment where, you're right, the map was leading me, but it doesn't know me. And I felt that, actually, if there was a way of sort of inputting what I needed, or actually how, what I need from the map, then that would, it would have been able to take me down a different route. And, frankly, it could have taken me down a much easier route that maybe would have added like 1 or 2 minutes. But you're right, that in that moment I was very much led by the map. So it's something that, we're not just investigating through the work, but it's like, it's lived experience, I think.
Yeah. I mean, kind of in response to both of that, in a triangulation way, and also to what Julian was saying, also in terms of like knowing your environment as a, I guess as a way of kind of like, maybe as a form of like ownership, some not ownership, I guess in like a legally binding sort of sense, but knowing it for yourself. And I guess, Julian, what you were sort of talking about, I wanted to say, I wanted to clarify when you said that maps should be updating. Were you also saying that maps should be updating in the sense, like, are you saying that we should be wary of maps updating when they're kind of run by big tech companies, or that's, yeah?
Absolutely. An example really here is OpenStreetMap, which is updated by the people that live in the cities. It knows shortcuts under bridges in Rotterdam that I have used, for instance, in Delft, and also in Berlin, that you'll never see on Google Maps, which is actually, by the way, a car-centric vision of a city. I think that's really important. Google, after all, Google Street View is the primary mechanism for gathering information about roadways, and there's this idea that bodies should be transported. That's also a very New World and an American picture that doesn't necessarily overlap very well when you go to a place like Palawan in the Philippines, Kuala Lumpur, yeah, and you start to see this highly there's almost like the gaze of the map maker in this case, if we think of Google Maps, is not interested in all of the places beyond the road. For someone that hikes a lot like I do, I go off the road and I see place worlds, teeming universes of interest, whole valleys that you'll never see on the map, rivers but of course for Google, it's just the road that goes through all of that green. I find that really interesting. Google's OpenStreetMaps is taking a little bit of that power back and resituating it in the lived experience of those that use it. Of course, it doesn't have a direction finder like Google Maps does, and I don't really use any Google products, but if there's one product I use when I'm traveling, unfortunately, it's Google Maps. I think that would be quite a game changer if the likes of OpenStreetMap were to offer that facility. Yeah, check.
Cool.
Great. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And you've also got a performance later, don't you?
As have you, yes.
Yeah,
we both do. Yeah, I will be sort of activating the installation in the foyer area at a little after 7 o'clock. I've been told that there's going to be many people walking out of the auditorium at 7, so maybe just a few minutes afterwards. But I'll be reading. It's a lecture performance, and I'll be sort of reading these ideas of dark adaptation. So that's at 7. Yeah.
Great. Cool. And mine is in.
That sounds great.
And mine is in like 50 minutes in the Angie Stardust foyer. So.
Well, good luck both.
Great.
I'm going to be sleeping.
Thank you.
Thank you.